All right, so today I'm going to move into the second half of chapter 4 in, let me see, who is it? Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin, and The Angel Out Ahead. And it's called Mundus Imaginalis, and we're talking about the imaginal world, imaginal practice. And before I do that, I have to try and summarize episodes 8 and 9 in this series, which is an extraordinarily what I would call difficult challenge. So, um, Yeah, I'm going to begin again. So again, we have the sort of empirical observation of metacrisis and meaning crisis through Schmachtenberger and Viveki, respectively, and accompanying a profound sociological shift that we can think about using Jordan Hall's Civium project from people living in cities, basically toward people living back toward small groups that is occurring in our time and over the next while. And the question is, okay, what do we do about that and while that's happening? And part of the answer is ecologies of practices, so intentional practice, so like a wisdom school model in a community of practitioners, you know, running a bit more of a viable worldview. And part of that involves, okay, what kinds of practices? And we have dialogical, imaginal, mindful, and embodied practices as a good menu to begin with. And then it's like, okay, thank you, Viveki. What is the imaginal? What do we mean by that? And Corbin's work is designed to help us to understand what that means. So we're looking at sort of this is stuff about the sort of re-enchantment of the world, a profound re-appreciation for the quote unquote esoteric traditions that we have neglected, circa sort of Enlightenment. So the idea is that we've inherited a lot of splits through Descartes and sort of originating in the 12th century and before that point, such as between inner and outer or subject and object, and between abstract and sensory, roughly speaking. And we can chase that back further into, before the agrarian revolution if we want to, and I've done that in other places. But at the moment, the point is, okay, so we're looking at sort of Persian Sufism, and the idea is that here is a tradition that functions as a kind of um, melting pot or meeting place for many different world traditions. The idea is that there are certain affordances, certain qualities, certain modes of being are sort of available to a person appreciating that worldview, able to take it on, that are not available elsewhere. And we're trying to explore a bit of what that is. And so specifically, we were talking about the relationship between the mode of being, what is called a mode of being, and the sense of time and history. And so part of the understanding here is that we've inherited one of the splits that we've inherited is this relationship between the knower and the known. And Corbin's work apparently begins from the idea is that there is work of this kind, intentional practice and transformative philosophy that can lead up to a certain epiphany, a certain realization that has to do with uh, I would say, becoming more present to an underlying sense of unity, which is between and beneath the knower and the known, which he describes as a kind of hermeneutic of the act of presence. And the point of that epiphany or realization is that one can notice not only the knower and the known artificially separated from out of the mind rather than in reality, but that our sense of time is similar. The idea being that we are present here and the past is present as an absence, that which is no longer here. And the future is present as an absence, that which is not yet here. And so on the one hand, we have the understanding that if we base our sort of model of reality, we have an imagining that we're in this linear time, this model of time which is linear, and we live within that. That this is a certain one way to say it would be a story. It's a story, but it's also an existential mode. It's a structure that we inhabit and live in. And it's what Cheetham, and by extension Corbin and others, have talked about as leading inevitably to nihilism. And the reason that they give for that is that what is true here, what is true in present, in a scientific, let's say, understanding of epistemology, how to know, is that we know what is here with reference to what has already been, with reference to previous experiment, like that, with reference to the past, which is absent. And so there's a way that everything is grounded in that absence. And so the notion is to correct for that. So firstly, recognizing that that is in fact a problem, and people much smarter than me have articulated that as a problem, among them probably Cheetham and Viveki. And so the point is that there's a certain realization that Corbin is talking about that involves it's a kind of self-reflective recognition. Quote, it's an epiphany that reveals the soul to itself as a being of light whose presence illuminates the world. So what do I mean by that? So what I would say is that there is a way of practicing with intention in a wisdom school model that involves actively changing our sense of time. And when we do work relating to the soul, well, firstly, what do I mean by that? Well, I would say that the soul refers to that about us which is sort of unique or most alive. A lot of artistic work, expressive work has to do with the soul. And I feel that just very quickly, bear with me on this, that one way to conceptualize the chaos and complexity of the world is to constellate that complexity into the opposition between dynamic forces that we see playing out in the world, whether it's men and women, left and right, spiritual and earthly, good and evil. This is a simplified way of looking at things. And then when we do that, the goal would be, can we intentionally practice seeing things from either side of those dualities? Can we practice taking up those sides, those binaries as perspectives? The idea being that when we do that, we can practice disidentifying from those perspectives. So by being able to step into those shoes and then step out of them again, and step into those shoes and then step out of them again, this is a way of seeing that those forces, that those perspectives, they don't have to unconsciously influence us. Because we might find it difficult, for example, if I'm very progressive, I might find it difficult to take up the point of view of a conservative person and vice versa. If I can practice getting out of that, then I can, in a sense, liberate myself. This is work of liberating the soul, I would call. So by doing that kind of work, we, unlock more of our uniqueness, more of our vitality, more of our aliveness. I'm going to suggest I want to make that an empirical claim. I think that is in fact the case. And one should wait and see whether that is in fact the case. Okay, so that's what I mean by working with the soul. I know it's still abstract. But then the point would be that the more that becomes possible, the more that is available to us, let's say the perspective of our own soul, the easier it becomes to encounter the kind of epiphany of which Corbin speaks. And that kind of epiphany is again an active presence. It's a kind of self-reflective awareness, the soul being aware of itself, in a certain way. And that epiphany, it reveals the world in a new way. So it's a different mode of being in the world. I would say that that epiphany is again led up to and then integrated with a whole ecology of practices that is not explicitly talked about in Cheetham. The point being here, several fold. Firstly, in relation to time, one is able to notice that the linear sense of time, of the past being present as an absence and the future being present as an absence, that is actually a model, a story, an imagining, an image that derives from the soul. And that takes real work. It takes real work to get that because the materialism that we've inherited is so ingrained. Because the scientists would watch this and say, what's Sam talking about? It's, of course, you can see the linear change, and it's like, no, that's actually not. The idea is that there is a way of being present that notices that, the train of linear time as, in a sense, a projection, something that comes from us, one way of looking at it. So there's a claim, and it's like, okay, that's all very well to make that claim, and I would want to then support that claim with, here is how to realize that through intentional practice. And I'm trying to work out how to do that. And it involves a couple of things. It involves the intentional practice that I've been talking about. It also involves getting a little bit more familiar with, quote unquote, eternity. So qualities that have to do with timelessness, stepping outside of time, stepping outside of the story of the ego, disidentifying from that story. And I do feel that there's some pretty deep programming that has trapped us that is going to take real work to realize the claim that is being made here. And so then there are several things from that point. And firstly, it's that not only does the sense of things change in relation to time in this way, about which Corbin and Cheetham are speaking, but what can also change is that there is a quote, imago, or in Jung, the self, and the images of the self, which he would call God images, that are in a sense within the soul. So there's a way that when we can take up the perspective of the soul, some phenomena which we can regard as well, it's a God image. I don't quite know how else to talk about that here. The imago, I mean, go back to episode 8. But something can come through the soul. It's not just being within the perspective of the soul for its own sake, although that's also valuable, but that because from out of the perspective of the soul, something is able to arise. Someone. And that emergent phenomena involves a different way of being present. So it's a different cosmos within which to live. So it's not only the revelation of a quote imago, this image that emerges through the soul, but also the emergence of the imago mundi, the world of that image. And so I would simply talk about this in the context that Working with the soul in this way makes available deep transformative change that can sort of successively update and iteratively update our sense of who we are and also our sense of the world in which we live. And that can give rise to a certain awareness. From that perspective, from that point of view, we can be aware of something, not just self-reflectively aware of ourselves, but also aware of the anima mundi, the aliveness of creation, the soul of the world. So this is a way of practicing so as to live not only from out of our own soul, but also to recognize the soulfulness or aliveness, the way that the world, the way that the earth speaks. The idea being that that is in fact already happening, and we are unconscious of that. We do not notice that. And we could, and that would be a good thing. Why? Why would it be a good thing? Maybe so that we stop ruining it, in a word. So I'm not talking about romanticism. I'm talking about a deeper way of being aware that is more sensitive to the living quality of the earth in a way that can disclose our care for that aliveness. So another way of talking about that aliveness or anima mundi is in the recognition of the earth as an angel. It's just a different way of talking about the same thing that for me doesn't really help a whole lot. But anyway. Okay, so what else? What else here? So I just talked about intentional practice as a solution, as a response to metacrisis, meaning crisis, that involves work with the imaginal in a way that is designed to uncover the perspective of the soul through the practice of perspective taking and disidentifying with different parts or different stories. The idea being that this kind of practice could contribute to what we could call the re-enchantment or re-ensoulment of the world, and that would be a good thing, partly by healing nihilism, healing the different splits or dualities within us that we don't notice that comprise our sense of who we are, changing our relationship to the earth in a way that involves more care, more respect, like that, more sensitivity. Yep, also changing our sense of time so that we're not caught in the nihilism of referring to the past which isn't and the future which seems fixed. Okay, what more? What else? Is there anything else? The answer being yes, there is more. And what's more is that through this practice, through this way of practice, one can not only feel, quote, the soul can only be at home in a world ensouled, animated with presences. So this is a way toward increasing personification. So another way to say that is from out of the point of view of love, we personify through agape. I know that's a lot. I'll just leave that there. So toward personification, toward deeper presence, toward animation, toward ensoulment. What else? Well, that kind of not only fixes nihilism, but loneliness. So there's a deep connection between our individualized, cut off, atomized way of life and our sort of nihilistic metaphysics that can partly be attributed to our sense of time. Okay, so real material, okay, a shift in a sense of Loneliness, aloneness, atomization, a shift in our sense of belonging, of meaningful connectedness, aliveness, so on and so forth. Okay, deeper presence. Okay, what else? What else? Okay, well, Corbin talks about sort of the Muhammad's conjunction to, or injunction to die before you die. And so this is a sort of, it's Gnostic in a way. So it's a way of, quote, turning the world inside out. The world turned inside out. What does this mean? What it means is the sense, coming to the awareness that our world, the world that we inhabit, we've thought and we've felt in an existential way that we are within that world. That we are within that world because it does seem that way. And this has the consequence that when that world becomes fragmented, when everything starts going wrong, you know, in the way that it has been, that we get fragmented. The soul is fragmented. But if we can come to the recognition that those worlds actually exist within the soul, then the soul becomes anti-fragile, is what I want to say. The soul becomes anti-fragile. It's from Nassim Taleb, Anti-Fragile. It's a book. And so it's a quality of resilience to change, resilience to disruption. So here's the problem there. The problem is not only our sense that the soul is within a world, but that we get stuck within one world. And what does that look like? It looks like dogmatism, fundamentalism, literalism. We get stuck in one particular story. And so the idea here is not simply to move to a new story, not simply to move to a new way of being in the world, a new mode of being present, but to practice with intention the skill, the capacity to interiorize different worlds, different cosmologies, different spiritual universes. We could call this paradigm mapping, although I don't think that quite does it justice. It's also connected to what some people call multi-perspectivalism, which is a rather tortured way of putting it. So the idea is that this is not I'm not talking about something, well, it is pluralistic, isn't it? It is pluralistic. The idea being that this is a way of encouraging us to step out of different stories and step into a new one, and step out of different stories and step into a new one, that we can practice doing that. And that while there might be one particular story that we feel most at home in, it's still valuable to cultivate the capacity to, in a way, be a nomad. And the reason that it's helpful is because it's against dogma, against literalism, against fundamentalism, against tribalism, and toward interfaith dialogue, toward the philosophical Silk Road, toward not only the taking of different perspectives, but the taking on of different worldviews. That could actually be practiced, that could actually be available to us. Heidegger talks a lot about this. Sorry, Corbin talks a lot about this. So it's a practice. The idea would be to, both through philosophy and I would say through intentional practice in an ecology of practices, to, yeah, practice not only taking different perspectives, but taking on different worlds. And I would connect here the work of drama, the work of ritual, the work of improvisation, that all involve a different, for example, I gotta think of some examples now. Pretend to be a tennis player with a partner. Can you do that? Well, how does the world appear like that? Okay, pretend to be a Sufi mystic. Okay, well, how does the world appear like that? Pretend to be a farmer. How does the world appear when you practice doing that? The idea being that by doing this, something is unlocked. There are certain affordances that are made available. I can't say exactly what those affordances are. I did already point to some that have to do with dogmatism, fundamentalism, literalism, and so on. I think it's pretty valuable to practice taking different perspectives, taking up different worldviews. That's fine. But why? Why is that really valuable? I think the idea is that there's a deeper kind of what I would call participation. So if we understand that the soul can go into these different universes rather than that, well, it's a way of expanding our sense of who we are. I would call that spiritual growth in a way. And I think I'm just going to check if that's all or not. Yeah, so I just want to connect th those 2 points really that I made together. And so what I want to say is, it strikes me that when we take the soul into different universes, when we can interiorize different cosmologies in the way that Corbin and Cheetham are suggesting, I think we get a different sense of time in each of those worlds. And so the idea here is to make available the sort of Gnostic sense of timelessness, being able to step outside of time in a certain way. The idea being that that can be a good and desirable state of being or way of being, to be familiar with eternity. And so for me, that would comport directly with Jung in the sense of um, working with the archetypes of the collective unconscious. So being able to, it's sort of working toward Levi-Bruhl's participation mystique or Eliade, the myth of the eternal return. It's like returning to this original time, being able to, I would say, ritually take up the perspective of different archetypes, make them available, make them present in a conscious way rather than being unconsciously influenced by them. There are some details there that I need to work out, but that's enough for now. So what would be the point of that? Yeah, I think part of the point there would be that practicing in that way, practicing down to toward eternity, toward timelessness, towards gnosis, towards original participation. Why? Well, I would say that that makes available that I would say that that is to practice in such a way as to disclose or unconceal some of the origins of what makes us human. So I think that that's what humans originally sort of worked out how to do, and we've forgotten that. And so I would call that a way to sort of reverse engineer ourselves out of the fall into history that began when we started to make stone tools by practicing skills, practices. I've talked about a lot of different practices here that can sort of accentuate the heart of human culture. That would be from the Human Origins playlist that has to do with facility with the right hemisphere, in a word, and a sort of down regulating of the left hemisphere and integrating of its perspective within other stories, other stories. The idea being that science and the scientific worldview is one perspective that we don't recognize that we are taking up from out of the soul. Okay, that's enough. That's a little clunky, but at least I got it all there. I mean, you can see how difficult this is to summarize, right? Corbin talked about valorizing a plurality of spiritual universes positively, and without taking up one's abode in them, keep an abode for them in oneself. Okay, I want to just mention one footnote before I continue into the second section of chapter 4, which is called Mundus Imaginalis. And that footnote is that I'm not blind to the necessity for dogma. I talked about that extensively. The idea being that, again, any duality that you can find, including between exoteric and esoteric, between conservative and progressive, between parochial and nomadic, between local and global, between a sort of fundamentalist culture that is set in this is how we do things. I think that's really important, actually, because I think groups of humans need creative constraints. Sorry, we need constraints around us in order to be fully who we are. I do believe that. I think there's strong evidence for that. Literally, even the way that our brains and beings are designed is it designed to be around other people. We've forgotten that at our own expense. And so the invitation is not to get stuck in any side of the dualities. And for me, Corbin does do that a bit. He's talking about moving between them all. And I'm like, great, but we also need to be able to be in one of them and participate more deeply in that one. So I'm not advocating Gnosticism. I'm not saying up and out in a world denying and pessimistic way. But yes to Gnosis with care. Okay. Now I'm going to pause for a minute before I keep going because that was already a lot, right? Okay. Okay, so I think what I've realized is that it's best to break this up as much as possible because there's so much material here and it's quite difficult to convey as well as to grok. Again, the emphasis is on where there are promises or claims made. The idea is that this can be turned into intentional practice through trial and error. Like if we that for me, they're talking about sort of the transformative power of philosophy, right? But for me, that's like, yeah, that's great, but there's quite a bit more to it that goes along with the rest of the sort of diagnosis and prescription that has been offered. And so I'm going to leave this here as a little summary and come back to section 2, Mundus Imaginalis, with Tom Cheetham. So I wonder how clear as mud this was to anyone. Okay.